The hypothalamus initiates a chain of events that control the endocrine system. It releases hormones, some of which are called releasing hormones, and others are release-inhibiting hormones. These hormones act on the anterior pituitary. Releasing hormones trigger the anterior pituitary to release hormones of its own, some of which are considered tropic hormones. Tropic hormones control other endocrine organs, such as the adrenal glands. Although the hypothalamus drives the system, the hypothalamus is kept in check by a negative feedback loop. Let's look at a negative feedback loop using the hormones of the adrenal cortex as an example. In response to stress signals, the hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH triggers the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH, in turn, triggers the adrenal cortex to release a steroid hormone called cortisol. Cortisol has many effects on different target organs in the body, but the primary one is to increase glucose in the blood. This sugar is an energy resource that allows the body to respond to physiological or psychological stress. In addition to acting on organs and tissues throughout the body, the hormones travel through the bloodstream back to the brain, where they inhibit the release of CRH. Without CRH, the anterior pituitary does not release ACTH. In addition to this effect, the cortisol also acts directly on the anterior pituitary to inhibit ACTH release. Without ACTH, the adrenal cortex stops releasing cortisol. This interaction is an example of a negative feedback loop. In this loop, the output of the system, the hormones from the adrenal cortex, ultimately diminish the input from the system, the hormones from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. This system turns on cortisol release, but then turns it off before cortisol levels get too high, keeping them at a fairly steady level. Because cortisol is the final hormone released in this chain of interacting structures, called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, its feedback actions are called long-loop negative feedback. In this system, the tropic hormone ACTH also exerts negative feedback control on the hypothalamus, inhibiting CRH release. This action is called short-loop negative feedback because of the proximity of the pituitary and the hypothalamus. The hormonal control center of the body can be found at the base of the brain. Here, the pea-sized pituitary gland is attached by a stalk to an overlying region called the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland consists of two distinct parts with different developmental origins. The anterior pituitary originates as an outpocketing of the roof of the embryonic mouth cavity. The posterior pituitary originates as an outpocketing of the floor of the developing brain. Both parts interact with the nervous system, but in different ways. First, consider the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary contains axons from neurons in the hypothalamus. These hypothalamic neurons produce two hormones, antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. Vesicles loaded with ADH or oxytocin are made in a cell body of a neuron and then transported to its axon terminal in the posterior pituitary. The axon terminals abut tiny capillaries. If a neuron is stimulated and fires an action potential, the neuron releases its hormones from the axon terminals. The hormones quickly enter the capillaries and flow with the blood into the general circulation of the body. The ADH-producing neurons respond to signals relating to thirst and water regulation. ADH stimulates the kidneys to conserve water, resulting in small volumes of highly concentrated urine. ADH also constricts peripheral blood vessels, which increases blood pressure. For this reason, ADH is also known as vasopressin. The oxytocin-producing neurons respond to stimulation from a suckling baby. When these neurons fire action potentials, they release oxytocin into the general circulation. Oxytocin reaches the mammary glands, triggering them to express milk. These neurons are also activated during childbirth, during which oxytocin triggers uterine contractions. Unlike the posterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary consists of glandular tissue. The gland consists of numerous cell types, which specialize in making and releasing specific hormones. An elaborate web of capillaries, called the hypothalamic pituitary portal blood vessels, connects the glandular cells with neurons from the hypothalamus. The neurons abut the capillaries and, when stimulated, release hormones into the portal circulation. The hypothalamic hormones travel directly to the cells of the anterior pituitary. Here, a specific hormone affects a specific type of anterior pituitary cell. Each cell type, in turn, produces and releases its own hormones into the general circulation. Once released, the anterior pituitary hormones travel throughout the body to their various targets. Here are some of the hypothalamic neurohormones. Let's look at the first one. Depending on the signals it receives, the hypothalamus may release thyrotropin releasing hormone or thyrotropin release inhibiting hormone. If it releases the former, it stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyrotropin. If the hypothalamus releases the latter, it inhibits the release of thyrotropin. Thyrotropin then triggers the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. This table presents a subset of the hormones released by the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary.